This morning, we're going to welcome our speaker, Dr. Andrew Bowman. H5N1 influenza has negatively affected business and on poultry and dairy farms across the country and here in Minnesota. Our swine farms next. Let's review the situation, assess the risk for pork production systems, and learn some lessons from the other species in the barnyard. To do that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Bowman, Professor of Veterinary Medicine at The Ohio State University. Please welcome Dr. Bowman.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. In my role at Ohio State, I teach influenza stuff, I teach pig stuff. I was in private practice and the 2009 pandemic sucked me back into academia, and I've been doing flu stuff ever since. And so for the most part, I thought I studied flu in pigs, but this past year has taught me a lot of other things, and so we're certainly going to touch on some of those points. So as we get into influenza, if there's anything you need to understand in the pieces and parts of this whole thing, is that the influenza virus traces everything back to wild birds, right? So in the influenza game, wild birds are the root of all evil, right? And so if you need a reason to go duck hunting, here it is, right? Those are the birds that are spreading influenza. We think almost all the genetic diversity of the influenza viruses we know today trace back to wild birds at some point in time. From there, we get spillover into other species. Domestic poultry is the one we usually think about, but it could certainly go elsewhere. And then from domestic poultry into other species, such as pigs, and then potentially on into humans. Right? So the human seasonal flu viruses we talk about today, right? It's cold and flu season. Those flu viruses we can trace back to wild birds. We can trace all the viruses we have in people, in pigs, in birds, everything back to that wild bird population. So those spillovers are important. They may get set up as endemic strains along the way, but nonetheless, right, everything traces back to the wild birds. So we're going to talk about type A influenza, and you may hear about some of the others, right? Humans, we have a type B as well. Type C viruses are pretty mild, and then type D is a new and emerging one. Cattle are thought to be the primary reservoir. We do know we found it in pigs as well. We're going to put all those other ones to the side. Today we're focused just on influenza type A. It's the big dog. It's the one that we get most concerned about, and so we're going to stay in that realm today. So, what do we know about flu? It's a negative stranded RNA virus. That means it does not have a proofreading mechanism. So every time it replicates, there are going to be mutations, right? And so it's going to change a lot, and this becomes very problematic for us with the idea of vaccines. We're always playing catch up because the virus is always mutating, right? We're always trying to catch up to it. It is an envelope virus, which means it's fairly easy to inactivate. It won't survive for a prolonged period of time in the environment, but nonetheless, right, it will survive for a little bit of time, especially in cold, wet weather, which means this time of year is not great for inactivating viruses. I know the nomenclature can be kind of problematic for us. All these H's and N's, and what in the world do they mean, right? And the H's and N's just refer to the surface protein. So in this diagram, the red and the blue are the different H's and N's. It'd be the same as referring to a person as a guy with red shirt, blue pants, right? Or green shirt and brown pants, right? I mean, that's generally the level of resolution we have with H's and N's. There's a lot of diversity within that, but nonetheless, right, that's where we're at. So H5N1 will be probably the focus of where we go for the rest of this, but nonetheless, there are lots of others out there. So the flu virus is changed through two primary mechanisms. One, I said, right, they don't have that proofreading mechanism, and so they will mutate every single replication. We think we'll get about one mutation per replication cycle. So it's always changing. If you talk to folks, that don't deal in negative sense RNA viruses, they think this is crazy. We did a project once with some cancer folks. They sequenced it. They thought they had a new discovery that they had a mutation. We're like, that's just flu. It changes all the time. The bigger problem we have is antigenic shift or reassortment. And so you can see kind of the picture into the virion there that there's all these other segments in there. They have 8 different segments. You've got to have one of each 8 to have a complete virion, but you can mix and match. So if you have a host that's infected with 2 viruses at the same time, you might get part from virus A and you'll get part from virus B, and all of a sudden we have a whole new virus that I can't predict, right? That's the stuff that gives us a lot of angst. I can't really plan for that, and so what do we do with that? And as I like to tell people, reassortment is real. It happens all the time. So we'll look at the 2009 pandemic. As we remember, that virus got called swine flu. We can argue all day long about that. We've pushed back hard not to have it called that, but nonetheless, that was what was labeled. The background of that was we had influenza in pigs, 70-some years, that had been circulating, and that's kind of that maroon virus. Around 1998, we have this reassortment event where we get the blue virus that was in wild birds, and we had the human seasonal. All 3 of those viruses come together and produce this virus we kind of see there in the center with the green on the outside and multiple colors on the inside, right? So it's picking up pieces and parts of each of those viruses. They come together, and we get a whole new reassortant virus. That's when we get H5N1 into pigs, and it continues to reassort from that point in time. It then reassorts back with the viruses we already had in pigs, right? And we get an H5N1 to emerge as well. Next thing you know, along comes the 2009 pandemic, and it's got yet another set of colors you can see in there, so a different lineage of a couple of those segments. We find out that comes from Eurasian pigs, right? We find out that Mexico was importing pigs from Europe for quite a while. They'd brought Eurasian lineage influenza with them, and in those farms we'd had reassortment occur, and so we had the North American viruses reassorting with the Eurasian viruses. We get a whole new virus that emerges, right? It eventually spills over into people. We have pieces and parts of it circulating in pigs today. Reassortment is happening quite frequently in pigs. It's happening quite frequently in wild birds. We don't see it so much in humans, for what reason we don't know, but nonetheless, this is the stuff that really keeps us up, right? Because I have no idea how to predict that next reassortment event. So if you want to look at the landscape today, this is data out of USDA's influenza surveillance stream, and you can see, right, that we have lots of opportunities. So each of those squares are essentially a combination of gene segments that would be possible. And you see, we don't have them all, but we do have lots of them, and the color density is kind of showing us how frequently they're picking up each of those combinations. Some are more frequent than others, but we have lots of possibilities, and we see them ebb and flow through time. But realize, reassortment, I mean, look at how many different viral combinations are on that map today. So oftentimes we'll talk, right, in flu world, we'll say, oh, hey, we broke with flu in a barn or in a flow, and we've got, an H5N1. Maybe we'll go so as far to say as it's a gamma or a delta. Realize there's a lot more in the background, right? It gets really hard to classify each of these different strains that we're picking up. So we as pig folks, right, we're fairly used to flu. The surveillance shows that it's pretty common. It's endemic in the U.S. swine herd. Poultry has taken a different stance on it, right? Poultry has taken essentially a zero tolerance policy to flu, and so they operate under a different set of standards than the pig world does. And when we talk about flu getting into birds, we break it into 2 big chunks: low pathogenic or highly pathogenic. Right? So highly pathogenic gets everybody hot and bothered, right? It's bad for birds. But realize that criteria of what we call a highly pathogenic avian influenza is based solely on how it behaves in chickens, right? I mean, this is the definition of how we got to highly pathogenic avian influenza. So I can come up with viruses that are deemed highly pathogenic, kill lots of chickens, don't do much of anything to other species. I can come up with low pathogenic viruses, meaning they don't really do much to chickens, but they're horrible for other species. Now, media loves to get a hold of the highly pathogenic term and infer that it's going to be bad for people or bad for pigs, or take your pick. That tag of highly pathogenic avian influenza only refers to birds. So try hard not to use that term when I'm talking about other species, but nonetheless, right, we'll hear that used a lot. Realize it's really only talking about how it behaves in birds. In general, right, when we have highly pathogenic avian influenza, and that's usually an H5 or an H7 strain, when that's in birds, we're talking severe disease, high mortality, right, bad for the poultry business. So if we kind of look at what our poultry friends have been dealing with since 2022, and we'll kind of talk about why that's an important timeline for us, but since 2022, we've had 1,500 flocks in the country infected. You can see every state on the map is lit up at this point in time. Oddly enough, USDA reports that 51 states have been affected. I don't know where the 51st state is, but nonetheless, right, that's in their tally. You can see the distribution, commercial flocks and backyard flocks. So this isn't just a one or the other. The numbers are astounding here, right? 157 million birds have been affected, 23 million birds in the past month, right? So this has been an ongoing problem. It doesn't look like it's slowing down. The darker shaded number of flocks affected, Minnesota's certainly taken the brunt of this. You can see, right, the shading there indicating Minnesota's taken more than their fair share. So it's alive, it's well, it's definitely affecting commercial poultry industry. If you haven't been in the grocery store recently, go try to buy some eggs, right? There's signs up about impacts of flu. So why is that 2022 thing important? And here's the deal. We were watching this particular lineage of influenza. It was circulating in Europe and Asia. We'd seen it circulating there for a few years. Late 2021, early 2022, we see this virus come across the North Atlantic, and we start getting detections in North America. And so as that virus comes into North America, it then spread down the Atlantic flyway, right, the way the migratory birds move down the Atlantic flyway. And along the way, it starts spilling over into some other hosts, so wildlife, fox, skunk, those sorts of things. And we start getting reports of some die-offs in both birds and in those wildlife, right? And so this kind of mimicked what we'd heard out of Europe, but it's certainly seeming a little bit worse as it comes our way. And so what we realized is the virus, when it got to North America, started to change. And so this is work that St. Jude Children's Research Hospital did. The line that is fully orange is the virus as it came over from Europe. The ones that start to pick up blue are reassortments, right? So we've hit on this idea of reassortments. Reassortments are bad for us to predict. Well, here reassortments are picking up North American viruses, right? So we already had our own flu viruses. They were low pathogenic in wild birds. Here, the highly pathogenic virus starts to reassort in the wild bird population, picking up new pieces and parts, right? So it says, oh, I'll take a couple pieces of the North American virus and stick it in here. And we start to get these new combinations emerging as it's progressing through wild birds. So at St. Jude, they took those viruses, they put them into ferrets to understand what those might mean for mammalian hosts. And what we find out is the fully Eurasian version, which if you look in panel B there, right, that's how many ferrets end up dead. Across the timeline, all the ferrets survive. When you start putting in the North American genes, they start having ferrets die off right as they come through there. You can take the same stories kind of told in the weight loss and viral replication. Nonetheless, the more North American gene segments that got put in with that H5, the worse things we're getting for the mammalian host, right? And so we knew the virus was not great in Europe. When it got to North America and starts reassorting, we start to find out we've got all these other combinations emerging, and lots of them are not good for our mammalian hosts. So we've been looking at H5N1 for a long time, right? I mean, if you'd asked all the flu people in 2008, what's the next pandemic, we all would have said H5N1. We were certainly concerned about it as a potential pandemic emerging then. Clearly we were wrong, right? And as my mentor told me, the only thing predictable about flu is it's unpredictable. I think that might be true. H5N1 is rewriting the book for us. So paper that came out, I think last year, looked at kind of the impact of H5N1 across the landscape, 2003 to 2019, right? So pretty long time span. You can see species that were affected, not a ton of them, and kind of the distribution of where those species were, whether they were terrestrial or they were aquatic. Look at 2020 to 2023, so right, just that short time span, and you can see a radically different picture, right? The number of species is overflowing out of that diagram at the bottom. Certainly a different distribution. And as we look across that, we're seeing all sorts of different distribution of aquatic, semi-aquatic, terrestrial animals being affected. It is radically different, and what we're learning is that it's behaving radically different in some of these species. Most of these wildlife species we're finding out are affected because they are found dead, and a lot of them, the issue is it's not typical influenza. So, who in the room seen influenza in pigs? Lots of you have seen influenza in pigs, and you would describe it as nasal discharge, barking, cough, fever. Leave them alone, they'll get better. It's kind of the run of flu in pigs. Lots of these, the nasal discharge thing isn't there. Nasal swabs are testing negative, but when you get into them, you find virus deep in the lung or potentially around the brain, right? And so we get a hemorrhagic pneumonia. We've got meningitis, neurologic symptoms. So it's not presenting at all what we think of as influenza in mammals. It's a totally different clinical presentation. And oftentimes, obviously with wildlife, we're only finding them because of the mortality events that are happening. So totally different presentation than what we normally think of as flu. And in a whole bunch of species that we really didn't think about getting flu ever before, right? So in a short 4-year time period, we're getting a whole new picture of what H5N1 might look like. And yeah, we were focused on wildlife, and yeah, we probably should say, hey, that was a warning shot to production agriculture, but I don't know that we really took it as such. Almost a year ago, right, we get these first indications of something's really brewing, and right, we got the report of the goat, or the goats that were infected, and that got everybody's attention, but it was quickly followed by the announcement of influenza into the dairy cows in Texas was the first report of it, right? And so that got everyone's attention. If you'd asked me February of 2024, do cows get flu? The answer would have been wholeheartedly no. That was not a pathogen we thought about. If I had taken a sample from a cow and sent it into a diagnostic lab and said, test it for influenza, undoubtedly I would have gotten a call back that said, you marked the wrong box, you're crazy, you need a vacation, something like, this is not what we do. Right, that's not a cattle pathogen. So, right, again, making liars out of us. Question we had was, is the goat herd affected with the same virus as the cattle? Like, is this some sort of ruminant H5 we need to be worried about? And what we find out quickly is no, it's not the same. The spillover into goat is different than the spillover into the cattle, and all these other spillovers that we've had along the way are different as well. So these are all independent spillovers from wild birds, right? Remember, wild birds are the root of all evil, right? And so here's the case, right? We're getting spillovers from wild birds into all these species. We've been hitting wildlife all along the way, and now we're starting to hit domesticated agricultural species. So we get the spillover into cattle, right? And then it's on from there. So here's our experience. We got involved with a dairy herd in Ohio that had an introduction. This is a 4,000 cow dairy, and they had brought in cows from Texas roughly a week and a half before the outbreak. And so by the time we got involved in it, they were in the middle of the outbreak deep. This is their sick pen. The sick pen is over full at this point in time. They've had to triage just the really, really sick cows into the sick pen. There are still a lot of affected cows out in the free stalls. They just can't manage them all. Estimates of how many cows end up becoming affected, they're at maybe 50% of the herd they think is affected. When it's all said and done, they're at over $1 million loss due to this introduction into the herd. They did have slightly increased mortality, but it was not mortality due to respiratory disease, right? It was mortality due to falling off feed, fever, wasting away, and right, just had no longer able to keep up with the rest of the herd, and so they euthanized the animals due to poor body condition. This herd did decide to go ahead and send their milk into powdered milk, so they also had additional loss there. And overall, right, this was a huge impact to this herd. As we got into the investigation, we really tried to understand what we were seeing and compare it to the other dairy herds. And so, we were trying to understand how this looked, and of course we've got our blinders on, and we're like, it's a nasal thing. It's right, flu in mammals is respiratory disease. So if you've ever used any of those rapid flu detects, this is exactly what I did on the farm. Took some rapid flu detects. If you're not used to reading those, 2 lines is positive, 1 line is negative. You can see these 2 cows. The nasal swabs are maybe slightly positive, although in the middle of it, I think there's virus everywhere. The milk, though, is screaming positive, right? And so you can see one of the milk samples kind of creeping in on the right there. The milk is screaming positive. You're supposed to wait 15 minutes to let those things, have their full reaction before you read them. The milk was positive as it was wicking up the thing, right? Positive right off the bat. No shortage of virus there. This matches with what we've seen in other farms, and as we now know, we have virus replicating in the mammary gland of cows, which is a whole new ballgame for us. So as we got into that, we took the samples back to the lab, and we know milk from the clinical cows, if you're a virologist, 10 to the 8 is a ton of virus, right? So in my research lab, I can't grow virus to that concentration if I tried. Like, I will have to take extra procedures to get virus to that concentration. And if I do it, it'll be in a couple of milliliters of fluid. Here I've got dairy cows dumping literal bucket loads of virus right out. And so when we think about how much virus is coming out of those cows and then into the overall farm environment, right, this becomes a huge, huge concern for us. In the milking parlor, we decided to do some environmental sampling. We wiped udders pre and post milking. You can see picking up virus pre and post milking. Interesting, it's not the same cows pre and post milking. Teat cup liners, the parlor floor was positive. All those things, right? There's a ton of virus in there. And what we're learning is like the dairy herds, I think the swine industry knows this, right? Dairy biosecurity was not the same as swine biosecurity, right? So when I was there on that farm, I can think of a day when I was there, UPS came, delivered packages. They walked right into the parlor, set down the boxes, talked to the employees, left. 30 minutes later, the UPS guy comes back, says, oh, hey, one of those boxes wasn't for you, picks it up out of the parlor, jumps on the truck, drives down the road, right? And like my inner biosecurity self is puking and thinking, what just happened? Oh my gosh, right? So in that high virus environment, I'm hoping that box didn't go to another dairy farm, but nonetheless, right, things that keep me awake at night. So biosecurity, right, is a whole new thing that we're having to teach dairy farms. So we took the virus, we took it into our high containment lab, we put it into cows, and so this was an intramammary inoculation, right? So put it right up the teat, put it in at that roughly the high concentration that we were getting it coming out, and caused massive infection, and within a couple days the cows succumbed to the infection and we had to euthanize them. So replicating exactly the disease we're seeing, All right, it's definitely replicating in the mammary gland of cows, which is this huge new thing to us, right? Like mammals, we never considered influenza replicating in the mammary gland. There's a paper out of the 50s where they did this. It was so far back that they didn't even really call it influenza. They called it a hemagglutinating agent. Okay, so maybe we had some idea it could do this, but really we never considered this as a route. So not only do we have a new species, we also have a new place that we know flu replicates and apparently causes pretty severe disease. Because we can't seem to get this out of our head that it's got to be a respiratory pathogen. We took an even higher dose, we put it in the nose of cows, and we only got mild replication. We said, you know what, chickens would be the sentinel, like chickens they're the most susceptible, so we co-housed chickens in there with them. The chickens didn't get infected. That includes a day when the cows managed to flip open a gate and get their noses into the chicken feed. So they were like literally nose to nose with chickens. The chickens still didn't get infected. So I think I'm pretty safe on saying it's not replicating to a substantial load, any meaningful load in the nose of cows. We didn't get virus in the milk when we put it in the nose. We didn't get it anyplace else. That was it. A little bit of replication in the upper respiratory tract. It didn't seem to go anyplace else. So we think it's really focused on the mammary gland in cows. So as we put all that together, right, we're now trying to play catch up. What we know is we've got almost 10 million cows in the U.S. How many dairy farms? Rough numbers, 18,000. We produce a lot of milk every year, and right, we've been a little slow on trying to figure out exactly how we're going to deal with all of this. In the start of the outbreak, we only had a handful of herds reported, and anybody who knows me says I can't leave well enough alone. Right, and I said I think there's a lot more herds affected than what we're giving it credit for. So last spring, my daughters and I took a Saturday morning drive around my neck of the woods. I drove from my house to campus, and we stopped at grocery stores and we bought milk. And I said, because I think if it's out there, we're gonna find some more, right? And so we stopped along the way. We bought some milk. My youngest daughter, she got hungry along the way, and she said, I want a snack. And we got her some cookies, and I said, do you want some milk? And she said, no. And I said, why not? She said, well, you wouldn't look if you didn't think it was there. And I was like, oh crap, she's been around me too long. So we do those, and we end up with positives. I get a few positives out of just my drive to campus, right? We get some positives. And so I said, hey, grad students, I've got an opportunity for you, right? And I sent them on a road trip across the Midwest, buying milk wherever they could. So the milk bandits ended up hitting it up multiple states as they drove out through there. They trying to purchase from different milk plants. So they purchased in 12 different states that represented milk plants in 18 different states. Yes, I realize that those milk plants don't necessarily say that's where the cows are, but it gives us some bigger geographic spread. So in April, we hit 36% positive, right? So that seemed way too easy, right? If this was really only a few herds that were affected at the point in time, I don't think I should have been able to walk into grocery stores and find remnants of H5. Now, certainly this got everybody good and concerned, right? And we had some pretty low CT values, meaning some decent viral load potentially, right? And so we get the idea that this might be a bigger problem. Of course, I found my report, and NBC News ends up, and so then this kicks the can open, and everybody is aware that we've got this issue going. In the midst of it, we took that retail milk, we fed it to mice, we put it on cells, we put it in eggs, and no viable virus grows out of it, right? So, important point, pasteurization is working, right? The commercial milk supply from pasteurized dairy products seems safe. FDA's done follow-up studies. We're very confident at this point in time pasteurization is working for us. No viable virus. So what we're picking up is viral fragments, right? Residual RNA. The virus has been inactivated through pasteurization, but we're still picking up some of that RNA coming through the milk, which could be useful in a kind of assessing the situation, especially at that point in time where we had no national strategy going on. So when we kind of put it on the map, right, as we look at where else we had milk plants positive, we were getting the idea that the situation was much bigger than what we were given, or at least what we had data to indicate. And we were hearing all sorts of rumblings, through various folks that, yeah, we think we've had disease, but we're not reporting it, or those sorts of things. So early on, we already knew it had spread quite a ways from those initial reports. So late April, we get the federal order, right? And now this continues on, and what we know is right there is a federal order about testing animals prior to interstate movement. Lots of other states have enacted pieces and parts of this in other ways, like going to shows and those sorts of things. But right, there is a federal order in place for lactating dairy cattle moving, and people want to know about all the, what about calves? What about heifers? What about this, that, and the other? The only reliable sample we know that's positive at this point in time is milk from lactating cows. And so that is the sample that we have to be focused on, right? And that's where we've continued to stay to this day. Now, we talked about all those, remember the initial cattle, goat detection, that phylogenetic tree, we saw all those spillovers. As we look at the cattle outbreak, and this was true to 2 weeks ago, all of the cattle outbreak strains could have been detected back to one spillover event, right? So this was one spillover, birds into cattle, and from there dissemination through the dairy network. So as much as we preach biosecurity and all that sort of stuff, one spillover, right? It was one spillover and then dissemination from there. We think it was late 2023, early 2024 when that spillover event happened. We certainly don't know when and where in that exact thing, but nonetheless, right, spillover happened, and then from there it disseminated everywhere. And so, right, important note to us, right, that one breach, that one anything, right, and the downstream effects that can have are potentially huge, right, as we have this individual spillover event occurs, and then it continues on downstream. So what's the current status of the dairy outbreak? We're up to almost 1,000 herds affected, right? And we can see the map, what we have reported today. There is a voluntary herd status program where you can be enrolled voluntarily, have ongoing testing, and prove that you're negative. Remember, we had 18,000 roughly herds, and we have a whopping 81 enrolled in that program. So not high uptake into that program. The national milk testing strategy has started rolling out through states, and so that involves testing milk silos, and that has identified new herds. So if you missed the news, Nevada had a detection, and it was a different genotype. So that giant phylogenetic tree I showed with the orange on it, we now have a separate introduction. It is a different genotype. A D11 indicates a separate spillover into dairy cattle, which changes the story a lot, right? Because one was we thought this spillover event that happened in 2024 was a rare, once-in-a-lifetime event. Well, we have no idea how we did it. It's probably not going to happen again. Well, now we've gone 2 spillovers in 2 years. I think we have to readdress that. Next problem is the D11 genotype is definitely of concern. So cattle to date have had the B313 genotype, and that genotype has caused mild respiratory disease, some conjunctivitis, and nothing too severe in people. D11, though, is a problem. D11 caused the fatality in Louisiana, caused another fatality in Canada, more severe disease with D11 in humans, and so that definitely has everyone on alert, right, if that's now circulating in dairy cattle as well. There is financial assistance available for lots of various things that might help the dairy cattle situation, right, and so that's all available today as we think about what's going on with dairy cattle. So as we kind of continue to think about where this impact is and where do we go from here, a few things I think we should consider with lessons that we could learn. As we think about this, this is a new commodity, right? And as much as we would like pork to be in a lot of households, milk is in 94% of U.S. households, right? And we are playing with a commodity that mamas feed babies, right? And so this is something that everyone pays a lot of attention to. The raw milk thing is a real deal, right? If you aren't aware, there are a lot of folks consuming raw milk, buying raw dairy products. We've definitely had associations with some infections traced back to what we think might have been raw milk consumption. We definitely have some pets that have become infected through raw dairy consumption, so we need to be aware of that. The worker component, folks have kind of dismissed a little bit of this, saying it's been mild disease. Obviously, having D11 in dairy cattle will change that narrative a bit. But there's a real underreporting, right? And that's potentially problematic for us because if we get a virus that gets right into people and is able to be maintained, we're going to have to make some quick decisions on what we do with that. Same as what we would have on swine farms, right? There's not a high eagerness by folks working on farms to end up on the government list. And so, right, these folks probably aren't seeking medical attention the way they should be. They are, however, conduits to their community, right? So if you work on the farm and then you take a virus home to your family and they give it to friends and onwards it goes, right? We've got to really put some protections in place around what we do with folks working on farms. All of the influenza people, right, up to a year ago when we talked about flu, we always showed the picture of the little girl kissing the pig through the fence, right, and said that's how pandemics might happen, and everyone laughed. Here's the new picture, right? The pig up at the udder of a dairy cow, I think, is what we in the swine world really need to be concerned about. And not that I think I have that exact situation, but I think we have used dairy farms as biosecurity buffers at times. I think we've thought there isn't a whole lot that moves between cattle and pigs, and right, we kind of thought that was maybe a safe haven. Maybe we've shared personnel, equipment, things like that. We're going to really have to consider that issue now. And then the story that's maybe picking up a little more attention more recently is the cats, right? And if you know anything about cats on dairy farms, there are a bunch of them unless you have influenza, and then they will tell you that all the cats seem to disappear, right? And so there's been a high mortality in the cats on dairy farms that have been affected with H5N1, and it's presenting in that neurologic sort of thing, and we'll talk about that in a second. So as we look at total human reported cases with H5N1, we're up to 68 of them. And you can kind of see on the left how many are traced back to dairy herds, how many are traced back to poultry. Vast majority, right, are ag-related, right? So these are folks that we interact with. This is our community. We've got a few that maybe don't have known exposure or we're questioning exposure, but the vast majority are folks working on farms that are becoming infected. So, right, this does become a real issue that we need to start thinking about, and what are we going to do? How would we protect folks in the swine industry too? So, domestic cat thing, here we are finding lots of cats presenting with this kind of initial lethargy and appetence sort of thing, just generalized not doing right, followed by maybe some progressive respiratory disease, maybe not, and then we get the neurologic signs. Most of these cases are getting picked up after they've been tested for rabies, right? So people are submitting the cases thinking that it's a neurologic cat, which for every veterinarian ought to think rabies, right? And they're submitting them for rabies diagnostics. It's not rabies, and then we find out, oh, they actually have H5N1. All right, and so certainly a thing that we've got to really think about, and maybe it's a warning sign to us, right? If cats are getting infected with the virus and presenting with atypical signs, that's another mammalian host that we might want to pay attention to. So, right, a few of these cases have been indoor cats only, and maybe there's some lessons learned there. But as we kind of look at what we've looked at, right? So these are cats residing on or near dairy operations. That's increased risk factor. Folks involved with dairy operations, cats being fed raw or discarded milk, right? Indoor cats that have been out, maybe hunted birds or something like that, or consumed rodents, those sorts of things. And so those risk factors, right, seem to make sense. In my mind, if I'm a swine producer, I start to think about if that's the risk factors for cats getting infected, I might think that those are things that concern me for pigs as well. And so, right, like if I don't want to end up with this virus, we might want to think about that. So we focused a lot to date on the cattle part, the B313, which is the orange piece on this phylogenetic tree. But if you look at that vast diversity of other H5N1s that are floating around and literally floating, right? They are in the birds flying over our heads every day. There are a lot more strains than just that strain. And as I mentioned, right, the spillover into dairy cattle in Nevada with the D11, that certainly gives me a lot of pause, right? That's a strain I don't want to tangle with. There are other strains out there that I really don't want to tangle with. And so, hey, we haven't seen the B313 enter into pigs yet, but there are a lot of other risks out there, other viruses, H5N1 viruses that might make that leap, and some of them may not be quite as nice as the one we have in dairy cattle. And to that end, right, we know that this happened. We had the Oregon case, and so if you don't know, these are backyard pigs, co-housed with some backyard birds, and we ended up with some pigs that tested positive for H5N1. They were euthanized out of abundance of caution by the state veterinarian, and it was not D11 or B313, it was D12, right? It was a completely separate one. And so you start to get the idea that there are all these viruses that could make the leap, and you say, yeah, that was backyard. I would say that as the commercial industry, we should take that as a warning shot, right? Like, it can happen. And so we've got data out of USDA. They've been putting different H5N1 strains into pigs. Some of them are able to replicate in pigs. Some of them are able to transmit pig to pig. Some of them cause neurologic disease in pigs, right? And so we don't have a good enough data set to say these are the ones we're really scared about. But what we do know is that there are viruses that are coming out of the wild bird population in the U.S. that are able to infect a pig and cause disease. And so, right, think about the headline that comes if we actually have it in commercial herds. Think about how many pigs we move. Imagine what the pig phylogenetic tree could look like in a hurry, right? We really need to be thinking about it. So to that end, we have been thinking about it. National Pork Producers Council pulled together a group of individuals, and we've been writing a draft response plan, right? So if you don't know, when birds become infected, it's a depop that barn, right? That's the way this goes. In dairy, they've been working under it's a quarantine. Once you test negative, animals can move, you can continue shipping milk. This has created a bit of a rub in the barnyard, right? Why? When this virus gets into dairy cattle, is it a pretty minimal regulations? This virus into poultry is a depop event. It's really caused some trouble. And the swine industry has sat here and said, are we going to get treated like poultry, or are we going to get treated like dairy cattle? Because that's a major difference, right? We want to know. And so we said, well, let's get ahead of it, and we're going to write our plan. So we have drafted a plan. It's out being reviewed by various groups. USDA is offering comment on it now with how we would handle this. And the focus really is on continuity of business, right? We understand we need to keep business going. However, USDA has also made it very clear that we are not going to tolerate an H5N1 circulating in pigs. Right? This is not an okay thing. We're not going to tolerate it. We're going to have to get a hold of it. but we can do it in a way, hopefully we can get it out of the pigs in a way that will allow us to still have business continuity. So one of the major concerns as we think about H5N1 coming into pigs, right, is the reassortment stuff that I talked about way back at the start of this talk. We may get H5N1 in, and it may reassort with some of our endemic flu viruses, and we get a whole new thing that is maybe pig adapted, but it's an H5, and who knows what we get out of that, right? The things that we can't predict are kind of scary when you put it on the board. And so as we think about what are we going to do, we do have a draft plan. Now, we all know how planning goes, right? And is that really what gets enacted when the bad day comes? I don't know, but at least we're starting the discussions now. We're talking about it. It's on everybody's radar, right? And so I think that we honestly end up somewhere in between pigs and dairy cattle. I think that's kind of what we have planted at this point in time. We're not going to ignore it, right? We want to jump on it early, but we also don't want to be depopulating barns of pigs if we can help it. And so, right, we do have a draft response plan set out, and hopefully we'll see where that goes. So, what can you do? Biosecurity, and I know like we preach biosecurity, and right, I mean, the story about the UPS guy at the dairy farm makes us feel really good about ourselves, right? Like I'm not the slowest antelope getting chased, right? But we can do better, right? Like let's not fool ourselves. I heard somebody say the other day, well, we must be doing great biosecurity because we haven't gotten it yet. Okay, have we seen PRRS, right? Like we're not that good, guys. Like it's right. We spread stuff around. So we've got to really be thinking about what we can do. Dairy cattle have to be added to our list, right? I mean, we know that there's potential for virus to be there. We've really got to think about that. But the wild bird thing is a very real thing, right? They are flying over our barns every day. And it's not just the waterfowl, right? We are seeing some of those, what we call peri-domestic species that come darn close, some cases, right, like right up into the barns. We've really got to think about how we might mitigate those strategies, or mitigate that risk and control that thing. The other thing I would really beg, right, is for you to look for the abnormalities, continue testing for flu, right? I heard somebody the other day say, oh, hey, we've had a whole bunch of strep pigs. And I question, is it really strep, right? Or is it this neurologic form of H5N1? And do we let it cook for a while before we finally do some diagnostics and find out? I know a lot of folks say, I don't want to be the first one, and I'm not going to test for influenza. But realize the longer it goes on and the bigger it spreads, right, it becomes an industry-wide problem, and it's not just your farm, it's suddenly lots of farms. And our draft response plan is really based on catching it early. If we catch it when it's everywhere, the draft response plan, right, goes out the window, and we have to come up with a whole new idea. The idea is that we'll catch it early. We've been telling everyone we have an influenza surveillance system, which we do. Now, granted, the submissions have been trending down lately, so we're going to have to continue to look. We're going to have to, realize that it's a possibility. If you've got the abnormalities, if you this just doesn't sit straight, you better talk to your veterinarian and get to the bottom of it. Hopefully, it is just a bunch of strep pigs, but by golly, I would like to find out early on before we've sent it all down the road. So with that, I can answer any questions you have, or we can sulk in the misery of influenza because it's been quite the year for us. And question? Yeah, so do we have any concern about dogs becoming infected? Certainly do, right? And if you go back to that second slide, right? Dogs do have influenza. They have their own H3N8, H3N2, they have influenza. So we know they're susceptible. We do have concerns. At this point in time, if it's a host, if it's a mammal, I've got concerns about it, right? And I think this thing is just, if you think about that pyramid of all those species that are now overflowing the pyramid of what's getting infected, it's all of them. So at this point in time, I've got my eye on everything, and I think we all have to, because it's, maybe B313 doesn't, but the next one might, right? The reassortants just continue to emerge. It's almost like, think back in COVID when we were, hey, here's the next variant of concern, and we're like in that same thing, that new strains just keep emerging, which is a new thing for us. When we had highly pathogenic avian influenza back in 2014, right? It came, it didn't persist in the wild birds, it died out, we got rid of it. This one is hanging on in the wild birds, alive and well. Like the wild bird surveillance that's been happening just keeps finding more and more, and like it's not going away. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about vaccines, right? And so H5 vaccines are a very tricky, sticky wicket. Right, because of the poultry version of we don't tolerate influenza, we don't vaccinate, trade implications are real when we have to certify that we don't use H5 vaccines in livestock in this country, right? And so there's a big policy discussion out there around H5 vaccines. And if you ask which industry really wants the H5 vaccine, it's poultry, right? Like they would love to have it. Dairy has several candidates. One that sounds like it's getting close. The new genotype, we'll have to see what we make of that and whether there'll be cross protection. I imagine there will be some cross protection, but right, vaccines look like that's a very good possibility. There is some interesting work out of University of Pittsburgh and Emory in ferrets where human seasonal H5N1, so 2009 pandemic lineage virus, seems to offer some cross protection against the H5. And so I don't want to say flu is good, but potentially the endemic flu we have in pigs is providing us a little bit of an immune barrier where we might have had some potential spillovers where it didn't go anywhere because of that. And like that's pure conjecture that usually happens over a beer, but nonetheless, I've said it early in the morning. There may be some cross protection out there in the pig population. We'll see. But vaccines, I think, are going to have a role, and they may play a role in the pig industry too. Like I think if the H5 vaccine thing gets kicked open, we're going to have to seriously consider where else do we need to try to use that vaccine or a vaccine similar to it. Yeah, so the question's about spillover into humans and the crazy number of California cases. If you take the dairy cattle map and focus it in on the last month, it's also almost all California with these couple in Nevada, right? And so the number of cases in California, the number of herds in California is just continuing to tick up and up and up. And like we all have this running, right, thing about how many more dairy herds could be naive in California at this point in time. Like it seems to be everywhere, which is then talking to like why we see so many human cases, right? Is their dairy cattle population is huge. It's spreading like wildfire, and we're seeing those spillovers. We also know that we have a public health department in California that is pretty aggressive about trying to find human cases and catch them early. We know that's not the case in all states, and so right, I don't know that there's necessarily a higher risk of spillover into people in California, other than the number of farms that are affected, the number of people that are working on those farms. I mean, there's also a large number of people associated with poultry depops, right, that have gotten infected as well. And Colorado took quite a few of those this summer, and that was due to it's 100 degrees and we're depopping birds, and PPE usage got a little lax, like respirator on top of head, right? And next thing you know, people get infected. So I think it's probably more about the situation than it is the state itself. Yeah. Yeah, so right, the question's about human vaccine, and I realize that's a controversial topic, but yeah, right, the ferret work would indicate that human seasonal H1 vaccine likely provides some cross protection, and so, right, we in the swine industry have a standing request that folks working in pig barns get their seasonal influenza vaccine, with the idea of we're protecting the pigs, right? If you're not shedding seasonal influenza, that's less flu for you to bring into the barn to add another strain into that big diversity matrix. Like if I can have one less column up here of more, right, viruses on the board, that would be great. And so, right, that's where that generally comes from. I think that may offer some protection. Realize it's not probably complete protection, right? If you're milking a dairy cow and she's shedding, right, 10 to the 9 in her milk and you're force stripping it out and aerosolizing it into your face, yeah, you may still get infected. Yeah.
Dr. Bowman, I'm from the veterinary diagnostic lab in Minnesota. So I'm the lab director. I don't know if there's anybody from MDH, the Department of Health here, but I can assure you that we are very proactive. We have a coalition with the Department of Health, our Department of Agriculture, and the Board of Animal Health, and we are looking at every single case that is, if we detect it in poultry or in any other species, we are doing more surveillance. So we are doing that into our platform for sure. So be assured that we are working on it. A question for you, on the swine surveillance side, do you see H5 surveillance in swine? And do you get questions about that? Because we do surveillance, but are we really looking for H5 or not? And what does the draft look like? Like, would it gear towards that side?
Yeah, so the question is about H5 surveillance in swine. And right, so if you're not familiar with the general testing paradigm in swine, the initial screen on every flu test is just flu, yes, no. Right, and then from there we get into what subtype is it. The National Swine Surveillance Program is geared towards unsubtypables, right? And so considering we don't have H5 in swine, an H5 would come up as an unsubtypable. Now we could talk all day long about how great is the subtyping assay and all that sort of stuff. That being said, there's also a giant push towards more sequencing, which would get us to that faster as well. And so, in the research realm, I live in a realm of everything gets sequenced. Obviously not practical for the diagnostic labs to go down that path. But the testing paradigm of looking for the atypicals, right, is going to be where we're going to be residing on that. In my research lab, we are running H5 PCR, just trying to shortcut the time to sequencing, right? But that's just us. We do a lot of surveillance in kind of high-risk populations, show pigs, things that we think might have contact, maybe backyard production, those sorts of things, things that probably have lower biosecurity and hit the list for us of things we want to jump on a little bit sooner. I think the normal testing paradigm, though, the unsubtypables is where we're gonna go. I do hear folks saying, like, I'm requesting flu A, but I don't want subtyping. I think that is probably not great from the national strategy. We need to keep looking. We need to know if we've got to find it early. Otherwise, right, it's a real problem for everybody. Yeah, so the question is around dairy manure that's been through digesting and treated. I don't know that anybody's really looked at it right now. In theory, waste milk, right, probably from infected cows, is going out with the manure stream, and so there's that potential. Although RNA virus shouldn't last forever out there, but I don't know that anybody's really looked at that. The The concern I have maybe higher is on potential feeding of dairy products, right? Do you know any dairy products that you're using in your rations, and are they pre or post pasteurization? Right, I think is one of those things that we really need to think about, because in general, right, we spend a lot of effort taking showers and washing trucks, but we auger tons of feed straight into the pigs, right? And so if virus comes in that way, we've really, our current plan wouldn't do much to address that. So I think we need to be thinking about those potential connections of if we've got unpasteurized dairy contact somewhere, we should pay attention to that. Oh, I'm over time. If anybody else wants to chat, I'll be around for a while. We can continue to talk, but if you've got someplace else to be, have at it.